So I'd like to read another poem from the volume called Gardens and Walls, which will be sung for the first time today. And like the poem that I read earlier called Blackwell's Garden, this poem begins with lines from another poet. In this instance, lines from Samuel Coleridge, who I'm not particularly a great fan of, but he interested me in this case for a number of reasons. One is because it's been speculated that he may have had what psychiatry and psychology refers to as mental illness. Late in life, his opioid addiction increased dramatically and incapacitated him to some extent. Often you see a parallelism in drug use and individuals who suffer either mentally or otherwise, but that association was very familiar to me in my research and my work. And then my vague sense of Coleridge was, that both his poetry and his poetics was in some sense an attempt to escape the world. Xanadu would be the most profound example, but it's this orientalized exploration of this sort of architecture of the unconscious, where otherness becomes like the playground of the imagination. But the imagery is extremely bizarre. It's filled with references to these kind of pseudo female muses, a flowing fountain that is highly sexualized, and everything surrounded by, again, multiple walls. So unconsciously or subconsciously, an imagery of sort of some kind of architectural protection or security to enclose this space of refuge, I suppose, this kind of like asylum of the imagination off from the real world, and not allow reality to intrude upon it. And then the poem that I chose has a reference to blue clay stone, which reminded me of the blue-gray gneiss that was quarried on Roosevelt Island as the primary building material for the Octagon Tower. I think in my reading of the poem, I had referred to it as Nice, and that pronunciation was kind of strategic. I didn't want to confuse the reading with a reference that I'd made to one of the titled sections, Menahanek, which is "It's nice to be here." I didn't really intend that pun, so I took the liberty of changing the pronunciation to Nice, or you can pronounce it any way you like, but that particular stone that was used on Roosevelt Island, became a central feature in the long poem. And when I was looking through Coleridge, I knew that Coleridge had a number of garden poems, and which sort of fit his that psychological portrait of him that I had as an individual like seeking the refuge of the imagination in this comfortable, like, domesticated garden, sort of well cared for as he was, and I chose a poem that has kind of an interesting story behind it. The poem is called "This Lime Tree Bower My Prison," And I found it, somewhat ironic because the referent is to the fact that while, I think it was Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, and perhaps some others were visiting, and Coleridge later claimed that, in the course of the visit, his wife inadvertently spilled some hot milk on his foot, and this disabled him from being able to take a walk. And the lime tree bower that he remains behind in, referring to as a prison, is a reference to having to stay in this place. It struck me as being a very different kind of prison. I'm sort of sensitive to these kind of issues. When people are really being confined and tortured because of their particular positionalities and identities, and enacted embodiments of difference. I take offense in certain kinds of hyperbole, not as much as I would obviously in someone like this politician, who somehow dares to compare rules and suggestions about the use of masks as safety precautions so that we don't spread a virus that kills people, referring to Marjorie Green, as somehow being like what the Nazis did in identifying future victims of genocide. I find that more offensive than the Coleridge, obviously, and we should all find it extraordinarily offensive. But I find Coleridge's, reference to this luxurious place to recollect in tranquility, somewhat offensive in comparison to the real prisons that I was, investigating on Roosevelt Island, or Blackwell's Island as it was called. So those, were a few reasons why I chose Coleridge, and then why I chose this particular poem. I'm not going to read the Coleridge, but Coleridge lines are interspersed throughout the poem, and somehow I think the italicization managed to get lost at some point. I see some of the words are italicized, but not as many as I expected. So I think some of the italics have been removed for whatever reason, and but there are quite a few lines if you wish to trace them out. An unsung wall. Wall my eye within the inevitable corrosion of your will to brick as form, to lime tree, enclosure, dream, fissure, separation, the network of veins and stress fractures in stone. Wall with skin of frost, lips closed in silence, eyes to blindness, thought to passage and the barring of passage, presence to interdiction, and solace at hilltop's edge. Wall of wind, wall of ember and roaring dell, narrow, deep, the ash from rock to rock like a bridge unkept, unarmed, barren and bent, unsung and damped, willow wall which trembles in the gale. In the skylark's departure, in the dark green file of lonely, lengthening weeds, fantastic and uncertain. Wall, turn and embrace, nod and drip. Whisper and promise in the muteness of memory, in covering tendril in the flicker of moss light, in gray-black shadow and deep purple shade, in the arch of sunrise and the words of blue, gray stone.